Our technology on a 1,000,000-ton scale comes out to about between $600 and $700 a ton. And that's kind of how things are measured in that in the carbon removal world is by ton pulled down and sequestered. And so that's what ours is. And so it's hard to compare it with other technologies because they don't necessarily have the same boundary. But for instance, I will throw one out. Climeworks is the one technology. If you were to look up carbon capture and storage, you'd probably hear about Climeworks because they are a company that's been in business for doing this, in the field for quite some time. And they're at, according to their website, they're at about $1,200 a ton, or they're selling on their website for $1,200 a ton. I'm not sure what their actual cost is and what they're including or not including.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Clean Techies podcast, where we interview climate tech founders and VCs to discuss all things building and investing to solve the biggest challenge of our generation, climate change. This is episode 84 of the show. I'm your host, Silas Maynor, and thank you for joining us on today's episode. If you are a returning listener, thank you so much for your support in the first place. And as you might know, we do put a lot of work into making this show happen. So we are asking you to take 1 minute to help us today. And what we'd like you to do is, if you can send this episode to 2 people you know, and very specifically, one person that you think will like this content, and maybe one person who might disagree with this content. We want to kind of spread the love around, share the show, see if we can get other people to start being listeners. So this is very, very helpful for us, as we do put in a lot of work, and we'd really love to be able to multiply the listeners the show is getting in order to spread the impact. So please do that. And if you are a returning listener as well, please leave us a review and show your support publicly. Thank you so much for this. Also, if you are a climate tech founder and you're looking for funding or partnerships, please reach out. We're always glad to help in any way we can. So feel free to reach out to me. My email can be found in the description. And then a quick thank you to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing, or you perhaps personally are looking to make a career change, please reach out to them at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. All right, let's get into the episode details. So today we have a dual guest episode with husband and wife duo, Steve and Beth McDaniel from Reactive Solutions. They are a science and commercial duo that have helped develop a coating, or a paint, I guess you would usually refer to it, that can capture carbon. Yes, paint that can capture carbon. It's pretty fascinating. So in essence, their coatings have blue algae inside of them, which allows them to function like lichen. So again, I'm not a scientist myself, but this is a very, very interesting episode in general. Their goal with this technology is to license it out for a massive carbon capture projects for large impact, and to be built at scale in order to remove gigatons of carbon from the air. So we're not just talking about painting your house with it or something. We're talking about very large projects that they want to deploy. So it's very interesting kind of approach, something very, very new and kind of novel. So pretty interesting conversation. I'd say the conversation has really 2 parts. In the first half, we talk about the science, the technology itself, and how they came across it, as well as their R&D process, which could be interesting for other scientific founders going through that process themselves. And then in the second half, I think it started around 34 minutes into the show, we got into the more commercial side of things. We talk about their business model, their tips for winning pilot projects, which could be very useful, I think, for some founders, and then some of their advice on focusing on the MVP and the importance of leveraging existing network to get the intros that they need. So if you're an entrepreneur in the hardware or IP side of things, this second half is going to be pretty valuable. So if you're not interested in the tech so much, you can go straight to there if you're strapped for time. Depending on what topic you're looking for, you can look into the description to find timestamps for those as well. We have those all kind of listed out in the description. So without any further delay, let's get into the show. All right, welcome to the podcast. How's it going, guys?
Very good, thanks.
Going
Really,
well,
really excited to have both of you on. So I guess just a quick intro. Why don't you guys give a quick introduction to yourself and just like the very, very high level of what you're working on, as we'll dive into it in a little bit more detail, of course.
After you,
Well,
Beth.
hi, Silas. I'm Beth McDaniel. I'm president of Reactive Surfaces. We are a company in the paint and coatings innovation space, and we have a technology that we're going to talk to you today about, where we have added algae to a coating system to derive photosynthetic activity as a climate change solution.
And I'm Steve McDaniel. Every once in a while they let me out of the lab. I am the science geek that kind of works on the things that Beth just said.
Very cool. So why don't you tell me a little bit? I'm really curious to understand, how did you ultimately get into this carbon capture space? Tell us a little bit about your former background and how it led to coming up with the idea for what you're doing and getting into CarbonTech in general.
Well, maybe I'll start out with just telling you it helps to build up some context around what we do in our day job, because this is part of it. And most people aren't that familiar with paints and coatings, or how large of an industry it is. I always say it's the biggest industry that no one's ever thought about. Almost everything around you is coated at some point in its manufacturing process. So if you look around you right now, every table, the carpet, your furniture, your eyeglasses, your computer screen, everything has been coated at some point, usually to protect that underlying surface. Paint and coatings differ only in the fact that paint has a color to it. But basically paints and coatings have evolved in our lives in order to decorate a surface with color or to protect it. What we do at Reactive Surfaces is we've added a third element to paints and coatings, which is functionality. And what we want is we want to be able to add functionality to paints and coatings so that every surface becomes a canvas for our functionality and can react to an environment in a certain way. And the way that we've done that in the past, we've been doing this for a couple decades now. And the way that we've done that in the past is we have pulled from nature. We only use bio-based additives. And so we've pulled from nature. We find some sort of functionality that we like in nature. For instance, an enzyme that breaks down greases, fats, and oils in nature. And we take that, harness that functionality. That's not our science, but what our science is to take that and put it into a coating system, stabilize it, and ask it to do what it does in nature, but on a surface. And so we've been very successful at functionalizing coating systems using enzymes, peptides, a peptide to create a antimicrobial surface. Can you imagine right now a surface that doesn't pass on? If someone sneezes on it, it does not allow for that. It breaks down that bacteria instead of allowing the next person to come and pick it up from that surface. So we're talking about what happens on surfaces. And so that's what we've been doing for the last 2 decades, is taking biological molecules usually and training them into coatings and paints and asking them to do what they do in nature on that surface. And we have several platform technologies of that. I'll let Steve tell you the story of how we came up with this climate change solution, because this is the latest of our platform technologies, where we've actually taken an organism, blue-green algae in this case, and placed that into a coating system. And in the same way, asked it, what does it do in nature? It photosynthesizes. In that way, taking you back to 8th grade biology, what does photosynthesis do? It pulls down carbon dioxide and releases oxygen and glucose through its process. And so that's what we've asked our coating system to do. And the way that we came up with that was kind of interesting. It had to do with a scientific expedition that Steve was on, where he just kind of had this aha moment. So I'll let him tell you that story.
Sure. First, let me tell you a little bit about photosynthesis, and I'm not going to geek out on you, but I'm going to tell you how hard or how unique photosynthesis is. It's the wherewithal for us, every single one of us, to get food. It's the food we eat. It's the only way we get the food we eat is through photosynthesis. So you can imagine that humans have been very interested in improving photosynthesis and figuring it out and trying to capture it, etc., since time immemorial. And the answer or the progress rate so far is 0. We've never been able to replicate it. We've never been able to artificially generate photosynthetic reactions. We've never been able to improve, particularly on the rate of photosynthesis within plants, even though it would be much to our advantage if we could. All of those things suggest to me, and did it at the time, that we are, beating our head against a brick wall in order to artificially generate a photosynthetic reaction. And we're not going to improve on that much. So realizing those two things and being in the business that Beth and I are, that is reaching into nature and grabbing functionality, it seemed to me that the only thing we were going to be able to do is to reach into nature and grab an intact organism. The other thing about photosynthesis is it is going on like gangbusters. Nature's really, really good at it. Every breath of oxygen you take is a result of photosynthesis. It's going on all the time. Nature in its carbon cycle is pulling down great gobs of CO2. We want to emulate that, right? I mean, that's our problem. There's too much CO2. We put it there, too much CO2 in the atmosphere. Well, you don't have to look too far to see a process that is, as I said, pulling down gigaton after gigaton after gigaton on an annual basis, and that's nature. Okay, those two things in common. Where is nature doing most of that work? Nature's doing most of that work, that is pulling down carbon, producing oxygen, producing glucose, we eat it, etc., are on very, very large surfaces that nature coats primarily with small microorganisms, in particular blue-green algae. And that's how it does. That vast majority of photosynthesis going on in this planet is being done in cryptogamic soils on the land. Cryptos meaning hidden, gamos meaning eggs, and little eggs, hidden eggs in the soil. And every single surface you could lay your eyes on has got these organisms in it, and they are just cranking away on photosynthesis. An even larger surface in which that's going on is the ocean surface, all the way down to about 200 meters, called the photic zone. In other words, in the zone in which light can't be captured in the ocean. So that is another huge surface. Lesson number one, you got to have large number of surfaces, large number of surfaces. As I've told you, photosynthesis, the photosynthetic rate is, it has a speed limit. It's a natural speed limit. I'll use these terms and we can talk about what this means in a minute. The speed limit in photosynthesis is 18 millimoles per hour per meter squared of surface area. And millimoles are just a way to measure mass. So there's a certain amount of mass of CO2 that's pulled down on a square surface area per hour. And that's the speed limit, 18. Can't get better than that. So that tells you really how important surface area is. You got a speed limit, you're not going to be able to improve it. Just make lots of surface area. So that's what Beth and I decided that coatings would be pretty darn good at. If we could, coatings, you could, like Beth said, coatings are everywhere, okay? Not that we're going to paint your room there with a photosynthetic paint, but coatings allow us to paint large amounts of surface area. So we went about the business, as Beth said, of doing that. Well, there's one other example nature gives us to follow, and that is nature actually has a paint. I bet you've probably gone hiking, Silas, up in the mountains, through the forest or whatever, and you'll see on a routine basis splashes of color, orange, a yellow, a green, a gray, a black. Those are lichen. They're growing on a surface. They look all the world like somebody splashed paint on that surface. They're very, very thin. Another take-home lesson, very thin. And they are a 2-organism amalgam. The part you see on the surface is a fungus, and it protects inside of itself a colony of blue-green algae. And that is how nature makes that paint. Well, could we do that? That was the question. Can we do that? Can we replace the fungus part of that amalgam of organisms with paint and use blue-green algae to do what it was doing in the fungus in our paint? And the answer is, thank goodness, yes, we can.
Mm-hmm. Out of curiosity, so when you decided that you wanted to work on trying to help solve climate change through carbon capture, how did you go about reverse engineering and identifying? Were you already very aware of these things in nature, given your previous work, and then you just said, okay, let's see if we can reverse engineer this and then put it onto a surface? What did that process look like?
If you're asking me, I would have to point back to one of the greatest minds, and it's really exactly what he said. Albert Einstein once said, I have never had an innovation in which I made with my intellect. I've only ever made it with intuition and inspiration. Well, in this case, nature is the inspiration. Okay. So like you just said, we looked to nature because we do that all the time. This was a little bit harder though, because we could not just reach in and grab one molecule, schlep it into a paint and ask it to do what it does in nature. We had to grab something more sophisticated and harder to keep running in a coating, and that is a live cell. And that's it's a little harder to do, but there are ways you do it. And again, you go back to nature and you say, well, what does this fungus do for these algae? Well, it does a couple of things. It allows sunlight in, because the algae have to have sunlight in order to photosynthesize, but it keeps out harmful UV irradiation. I'm talking about the fungus. It allows in moisture, as much moisture as it can allow into these fungi, to the algae, but it prevents moisture from escaping, because you want it to remain moist in there for the algae, right? It is capable of spreading out very thinly. It's very important. The thinness of this thing is important, because that way you allow more light into the algae. If it was real thick, then you wouldn't see much light going into the algae. So it's got to be thin. So all of those things are the teacher is nature. Just listen, use your intuition, use the inspiration that nature gives you. You're probably not going to be able to think your way through this one entirely. That's what I would say. Mm-hmm. Don't be silly and try to recreate something that's already which ain't broke. It ain't broke. Don't fix it. Okay, yeah. Nature did a damn good job.
What was the R&D process like once you decided? Like, how long did it take from the idea that you wanted to kind of solve this and then actually getting it to work on the surface? What was that timeline?
Well, I went to my president and I said, hey, I have an idea. I'll let her tell you about how that rant came out.
Well, it really started just on a more personal level, just personal story. It started out years ago when Steve was on an expedition. This is the story that I thought you were going to tell. But when you were on an expedition in the Arctic, scientific expedition, this was a space-related expedition, and saw in the vast, expanse of the Arctic with all the rocks, and there was you could describe it better than me, but it's just like big gray giant boulders everywhere, and nothing constructed there. And in the vast scenery of the Arctic, he saw this big rock with a big red splash of red paint on it, and he thought, wow, that must be a GPS marker or something like that. And then when he got closer to it, he saw that it was lichen. And so the fact that the lichen could grow in that kind of environment just stuck with him. And he thought, this is like paint. It adheres well to the surface. It's lightweight. It's thin. We're in the paint business. How can we utilize this in nature to create a paint? Well, that was long before we ever were struck in the head with a steel-toed boot about the serious nature of climate change. And so it had been just kind of, round in his head, and in this great mind had just been bouncing around in his head for all those years. And then in 2018, when that was when we got kicked in the head with the steel-toed boot, when the International Panel on Climate Change released its report. This is the UN's International Panel on Climate Change, who is, a selection of thousands of scientists all over the world that come to this, that come together and make this report. And so it is the definitive resource for climate change. And the October 2018 report was was very, very dire. And it finally struck us. And that was when Steve said, I've been, this idea has been running around in my head. I've got to put this, I think that we need to take, that's when he came to me, the president, and said, I think we need to take this idea and put it into motion. And within a week, we had sat our technical team down together. We have our labs run out of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, which is one of the premier paint and coatings. The University of Southern Mississippi is a premier paint and coatings or polymer department in their university. And so that's where we are located. But we sat down with our team and we said, we want to take off in this direction with this technology. No one's hiring us to do it, but we think it's really important and we think we'll be a success. And so from that moment on, we started developing carbon capture coatings, and they do work. They're very good at capturing CO2. So that was kind of the genesis of, and then a weird thing happened. This is so not science based, but a weird thing happened where while all this was going on at the very beginning, we came into our office and there was this book on lichen. It was just sitting in our conference room. To this day, we've never figured out where that came from.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Very, very funny quirky story. Yeah, so I guess I want to maybe just recap this. So we've talked about the technology in general. So kind of to summarize it, as if I was trying to explain it to my grandma. In essence, you have found a way to take a process which nature does, which is essentially capture carbon, and get it to grow on a surface, on a paint. So what you would do is you paint surfaces on very, very large scale, and then this can capture massive amounts of carbon, perhaps on the ocean, perhaps in units built, I don't know, kind of out in open air. I'm assuming you could put it in point source capture as well. So is that correct to assume, to summarize kind of what we've talked about here so far?
Yeah, let me just say.
Sorry, Beth, I just need to correct one thing.
Of course.
I said it's an important distinction. You said, so you're making paints that grow algae on top of them. And that's not what's happening. Just like the fungus, okay, on the lichen, we're putting the algae inside of the paint. So you wouldn't be able to run your hand across the top of our paint and get algae off. It's inside of the paint. So that's doing pretty much exactly what happens in a lichen.
Okay, interesting.
Okay. Go ahead, Beth.
Yes, and so
on the we were talking about, I believe, the scale of what we're doing it here on the air capture.
Right. Oh, I was going to mention, yes, it's a technology that it's very flexible, because you kind of caught on to that in your last comment, and that is, we would create modules, by the way. So for your audience, I want them to think this isn't something that's getting painted on skyscrapers, although it could, but that's just not the most efficient way to handle it right now because of the depth and breadth of the problem. We need to imagine facilities in which we create a whole bunch of surface area in, say, a modular fashion. And so we can use those to actually capture CO2 from the ambient air. We could put those modules densely filled with carbon capture coatings next to a point source where the CO2 was being emitted from an industrial process, for instance, and capture that CO2. In fact, CO2 goes great in our system because algae love it. And so the more CO2, the better the system gets. And so that's actually a way that we can help companies mitigate their CO2 emissions. And then we can put it in a different kind of embodiment and put it on the ocean. And that's how we plan to scale up to a gigaton level, which is really the only thing that matters. A gigaton is 1 billion tons because of the level of the problem. But I'll also say that, we, back to the paint, we do all sorts of things to that paint to make it amenable to working the way that we want it to, and to photosynthesize. And that's our business. That's what we do all the time. So we manipulate paints and coatings for instance, like Steve was saying, to capture to capture moisture and to hold moisture. Those are things that we do regularly with paint. We know how to do that. We know how to let sunlight in, but prevent UV. And we do that in paints all the time. So we are using our skills in the paint industry to make this the best working, carbon removal system that we can make.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's talk. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I have to remind myself of this all the time. So maybe I'll remind you and your audience, and that is, Beth mentioned it. You have to get, if we're going to do any good at all, remember, every year right now, we're putting in 30 to 50, we humans are pushing out, emitting about 30 to 50 gigatons per year of excess CO2. Okay. We got a lot to catch up with, but that's happening every year. And so for us to have technology that's going to make even a dent in that, we've got to get to the gigaton level. Okay. Not easy to do. Let me remind you that, 1,000 days ago, Silas, you were almost 3 years younger. Okay. 1,000,000 days ago, Jesus Christ hadn't been born yet. Rome was just being founded. 1 billion years ago, not humans, but proto-humans were just figuring out how to use rocks as tools. And so, there's an unbelievable difference between 1,000,000 and 1 billion. Mm-hmm. What Beth described to you just then was in the modules, et cetera, we can get, and in fact, as a part of the X Prize submission that we made, we can get to 1,000,000 tons of pull down. We're pretty confident in that. Mm-hmm. But when we sat back and looked at it and realized what it was going to take to get to 1 billion, there was only one surface in the world to do that on, and that was the ocean. Mm-hmm. So we had to figure out how to put these surfaces on the ocean.
Mm-hmm. So I do want to talk about, because obviously there's a commercial aspect, is when you compare the cost of the technology, of your technology, versus other, some other types of carbon capture technology that are out there. And by the way, I don't know how to compare those per se, other than, actual plants and trees of that nature, because I'm not an expert in those things. But when you compare the costs, what does it typically stack up to? If you're looking at, I want to maybe break it down to point source specifically, if you can break down that cost structure. And then if you have other examples that are similar for ambient air, such as the ocean example, if you can compare them, just so people can understand the cost of these projects compared to others.
Well, I'll let Beth do that, but let me make sure you understand something. To my knowledge, the way that point source carbon emissions are handled is by absorption onto filters. In other words, they don't let the carbon go out into the atmosphere, but they capture it on filters, and then they do something with those filters. Okay. Usually what they do is they scrub those filters and the carbon goes out. And so we're not talking about carbon capture and sequestration permanently with most point source carbon capture. I'll let Beth go ahead and answer the major part of your question, though.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So when you're talking about point source, what the technology is now in the industrial settings is to capture that CO2. But like Steve said, it's not, the other part of that equation is that we have to permanently, or durably is the term that's used in the climate change world, durably sequester that CO2 for at least 100 years and hopefully much more. And so that's what the scrubbers that are used in industrial settings for CO2 are not doing. They're not sequestering it. They never were meant to. And that is a really good point, because that has to be part of the equation, or otherwise, it doesn't really do anything for us if we haven't sequestered it. So we have what happens in our system is the CO2 is stored in the paint until such time as we harvest that coating, put it through a chemical chelator, which separates the components of the paint from the algal biomass that's accumulated, which holds the CO2. And then we can take that CO2, that algal biomass, and there's a variety of things we can do with it. there's utilization into other products and such, but one form of durable sequestration that we are definitely considering in our system would be biochar, which is known in the industry as a durable sequestration method. And so that's how that's how our process goes. So as far as cost goes, in comparing costs, the important thing is that we compare a cradle to grave system with a cradle to grave system. And what you're going to find when you compare carbon removal systems is it's kind of a nascent industry, first of all. So it's early on. And so not everything is mapped out perfectly. And so you have companies that are doing, carbon capture and they're capturing it in some way, usually a solvent or a sorbent methodology. And then they take that CO2 that's acquired from the carbon capture. In most cases, when you hear about carbon capture, you'll hear about carbon capture and storage. The storage part is the sequestration part. And that's where they take CO2 and shove it deep into the ground, inject it into saline formations or old oil wells that have been emptied out and use that to store it. So if we're going to compare one to, and we can talk all about that, okay? And there's issues with it, but that is what carbon capture and storage has up until now been known to do. And when we're comparing the cost of those technologies with ours, we have to include that sequestration part. And what we've noticed in comparing technologies is not everyone draws the same system boundaries for their costs. So they'll develop a cost for their technology, but it might not include sequestration. So obviously that has to be included in order to compare with ours. Our technology on a 1 million ton scale comes out to about between $600 and $700 a ton. And that's kind of how things are measured in that in the carbon removal world is by ton pulled down and sequestered. Mm-hmm. And so that's what ours is. And so it's hard to compare it with other technologies because they don't necessarily have the same boundary. But mm-hmm. For instance, I will throw one out. ClimeWorks is the one technology. If you were to look up carbon capture and storage, you'd probably hear about ClimeWorks because they are a company that's been in business for doing this, in the field for quite some time. And they're at, according to their website, they're at about $1,200 a ton, or they're selling on their website for $1,200 a ton. I'm not sure what their actual cost is and what they're including or not including.
Mm-hmm. Got it. So I want to talk about the business model too now here. So I think we're getting to the money. So if two things, I think it'd be important for us to talk about your model of licensing versus being the actual developer of these projects. But kind of let's fast forward before we get to that part to somebody who is using this, whether it's, you're doing this project yourself or another company is doing this. Can you explain the model for why these things can actually make money because of carbon credits and kind of carbon offsets market? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, there's an ongoing commodities market called the carbon offsets market. And there's a voluntary and involuntary market. I'm not an expert exactly in that market, so I won't go into it. But if you are pulling down a ton of CO2 and supposedly it's supposed to be permanently sequestered, I'm not sure that the market is actually living up to its own expectations. Okay, and there's questions about that, but that is what it's supposed to be, is a ton of carbon that's captured and sequestered can be sold in that commodities market, and another company can buy that. And in order to, if a company, for instance, is trying to lower their carbon footprint, then, but they have to emit in order to do their industrial process, then they can emit a ton if they buy a ton that's been captured on this market. But we have to make sure that that ton is really captured and sequestered, or otherwise that whole system will work against us, because if it's not, then what we're doing is allowing someone to actually release CO2. And so then it becomes a CO2 positive situation. And we don't want to have that. We have to make sure that the carbon offsets that are being sold include the sequestration part, and they're really being taken down. And there's other requirements for that. There's something called additionality. And if you've already got a forest that was not going to be cut down in any case, and then you say, I won't cut down this forest, so therefore that's a carbon offset credit that I'm due. Well, that's not additional because you weren't going to cut it down in the first place.
Yeah, I mean,
so I think adding.
I think just, I know this podcast will come out a little bit after this, but I think just this week there was a big bunch of publicity around how many of these carbon markets are actually non-verified, right? It's a very, very large percentage. So there needs to be greater transparency there. But just kind of summarize, so in essence, right, because there are companies willing to pay to offset their carbon, there is a market for these types of projects. It's not just something that the government needs to sponsor, although the government may have an interest in sponsoring those, of course. Private developers could hypothetically develop these projects and then sell these in the carbon markets, right? So there is a business model, right? Which is what I always want to point out to people, is that these things are not just philanthropy endeavors. These are like real business models that are there that can make money in addition to helping solve climate change. So
correct. And there's also the instance where governments come in, and it hasn't happened in the United States, but it has happened in other countries around the world, where they impose a carbon tax. And then that is part of the business model, because there's no reason to pay the tax if you can, actually pull down the carbon. It gives you the incentive to do it for at least that much money. And so that becomes a part of the business model, the carbon tax.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I want to go back to talking about the model that you guys have chose. So when you set out to build this, maybe this is just something that came naturally because of your past work, but what is the business model that you have chosen to go after? I think we've talked about this prior to the show, but can you talk about it and why you chose this business model?
Well, maybe I could tackle that one. I in another life, I'm an intellectual property attorney. I've spent my whole legal career dealing with licenses, trade secrets, patents, and the like. One thing I've noticed in that long career was there are people who really are good at innovation. All right. And they're really good. They come up with really cool stuff and stuff that's very commercial. And then they try to put on a different hat and they become a salesman. That's pretty much an invitation for disaster. Okay. Because you're taking your innovator and making him the guy that plays golf and shakes hands. All right. And I'm not knocking that. That's a very important skill set. Okay. And so what you want as an innovator, we want to be as an innovator, is really and truly do what we do and do well. And that's important to you if you want to license our technology, because we're going to continually and constantly be pushing to you the newest, latest, and greatest. Version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4. This is not a static situation. You're going to want to grow these things. You're going to make them more effective, more surface area. You're going to want to make the biochar more valuable. So there's all sorts of reasons why you want your innovation team to continue doing what they do. All right. You don't want them to become the manufacturer. You can do that on a toll basis. Toll meaning I can hire somebody to manufacture it. Okay. And you don't want them out there selling it. But you want them to support your manufacturing and you want them to support your sales. So you've got to keep that group. Now, we're a small innovation group. We made the decision that we wanted to stay that because we're good at it. And therefore, we look for people who want to come in and grab it and manufacture or pull down the carbon, or actually go out in the commodities market and sell that, because they're good at that. And that's the model. Is that where it is divide and conquer, if you will. Don't be all things to all people. You'll probably fail at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really interesting. I think a lot of people, I think it's difficult because you have obviously the need to make a profit if your company is going to continue to succeed. And then there's also companies who are very, very like, hey, this is our IP. We came up with it and we're going to be the ones to go do it. However, like you said, there's a couple factors at play, right? We've got climate change is not slowing down anytime soon. So we really need to scale these things. And one company can only scale so fast. And in addition, perhaps even if they could scale ultimately very, very, very fast, there's so many challenges with running a global organization that you then can lose so much efficiency, right? And it can really have negative effects. I think that there's this like battle between, should we try to capture the market and become absolute like super rich, or should we just focus on, doing the thing that we can kind of get this technology out there and still make some money by licensing the technology, but really allow for a democratization of this technology globally. So I think it's really fascinating. These models are really interesting to me.
Let me point
Yeah.
one thing out to you, Silas. This is a very odd industry in a way, because in fact, Beth and I don't consider people who are doing similar things to be competitors. We think of them as colleagues, and we better think that way. This is a cooperative process. I've got to wish, and I hope, that my quote unquote competitors get really good at what they're doing and pull down billions of tons, right? You don't need to focus all that in one company. Let's get them all out there doing all things. Let's have a toolbox that has all sorts of tools in it, right? That's number one.
There's plenty of meat on that bone. There is plenty of meat. Unfortunately, the problem is gigantic, and everyone can slot in at some point. So we encourage, our colleagues to innovate as well.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I think it's also an opportunity for capitalism to get a better reputation, if you will, because it's always about like, oh yeah, we need to have 88% market share. We need to have everything, right? And then there's just a couple small guys. When in reality, that's probably not actually better for humanity as a whole. It's probably better to have many people sharing the pie and competing, right? As we know, competition breeds innovation.
A very good innovation system in this country that came through capitalism has been NASA. NASA, they have a mantra. They don't do anything without duplicating a process. They want to have 3 or 4 ways to do the same thing at all times. It's called redundancy. Okay, we need redundancy here. If one fails, another one needs to slot in. Or if one can do one part of it and the other can do another part of it, that needs to happen. Let me give you an example. Beth used the word the term Climeworks, a very interesting company. One of the things that they do outside their boundary is they, as Beth says, shove it down a hole. Okay. I'm just going to tell you what Steve thinks about that. And that is, I don't think it's a real good idea. Okay. It's going to take a whole lot of pipeline. It's going to take a lot of regulatory approvals, et cetera. If all they did was to give us their CO2, just give us your CO2. We'll handle it for you. You don't have to shove it down a hole. We'll turn it through a biological process into something you can spread on the ground. So, you can.
Shoving it down a hole is a foregone conclusion in that industry. That's how apparently there's enough space to do that. And yet, what we're not addressing, I think, in our panic is, and there are definitely studies about this because the oil companies have been using this kind of technology for a while, but we're passing up water tables going down there. There's risks of leakage. There's risk of seismic activity, as a result of that. It's kind of like fracking is what we'd be doing, and it's not been done at that level ever. And so maybe it shouldn't be such a foregone conclusion. We should look for other ways to do it. Well, biochar is one of those ways. And like Steve said, we can come together with these colleagues and find the best solution for humanity rather than just, this is something that we can do in order to sell.
Right. Right. And Beth made a very good point, and we think about it all the time because you're probably asking us, how are we going to make money? Right. Well, we have to worry about making money. It's just like everybody else. However, remember, there are somewhere between 30 and 50 gigatons of CO2 put into the atmosphere every year. And so if all you make is $1 per ton that you pull down, you're still making pretty good money. Okay. So there's a lot of meat on the bone.
Yeah, no, I think it's really fascinating situation for an opportunity for things to be changed here. So I think I want to move on to, I think, something that could be very valuable for other entrepreneurs listening, especially in these more difficult projects. And it's not just a software company. Could you talk about the process of winning a pilot project and the difficulties of that? What are your tips for other people going to do that? I just kind of want to hear about this process as a whole.
Well,
we're in that process.
Go ahead, Beth. Go ahead. please.
We're in that process right now. And we've been kind of thrust upon the global international scene by our association with an NGO, a few NGOs and accelerators. Net Zero is one of them, and the MC Row project. And what these are is, we're trying to jumpstart this technology and get it recognized around the world as fast as possible to do the job as quick as possible. And so pilot projects are one of the steps in that, as we move forward. And so one thing that we're doing we're actually the country of Bulgaria, as a result of the MC Row project, what they've been doing for us, the country of Bulgaria is interested. They're an EU country and they're interested in a pilot project, and they're interested in launching this technology in the EU, which is very exciting for us. And so we've been working on how to do a pilot with them, and it will take, we want to bring different forces together. Like, for instance, we are great at polymer science. We're awesome at molecular biology and microbiology, and we have that skill set within our framework, but we're not, and we have some engineers, but we need more engineering work, for instance. So that's one thing that we're looking for at, we're talking to Bulgaria about, what kind of engineering services can you provide so that we can maximize these modules that we're using and make them even better than what we've designed already. And so we are looking for actual input from the countries that we're talking to in that way, that into the pilot facility. Not only that, but what we seek, and I know I'm getting off a little bit from what you were saying, but it kind of helps to explain it. But for instance, if we were to have a direct air capture facility using modules that have densely packed sheets of coated surfaces with our algae paint. And so we have a facility out in, just located, these are location agnostic. And so you can kind of put them anywhere that there's a flat surface. And so if we were to have those out there, who would be best to take care of those, to take care of that algae and to grow it up? Well, farmers. That's who we're looking to. We want farmers in local places because they're the ones that know how to grow stuff up, and that's what we need. And so we want to innovate certain industries also in these areas. There's a bigger picture. We want to innovate the farming industry and make that even better. We want to utilize local talent for boosting our efficacy. And but what a pilot plant would look like, for instance, in Bulgaria might be like 500, what we're talking about right now is 500 meters cubed, which is going to pull down about 20 tons of CO2 annually. So it's proving it up. We'd have excuse me, we'd have to make it much bigger to be, to attack a larger problem. But but since it's modular, the system is modular, that's really all you have to prove, because if it proves it up, then you just add more modules.
Mm-hmm. Well, that makes a good point. Your question, Silas, excuse me, one of your question was, what do you tell young entrepreneurs, and I hope there are many, many of them that would get into this business, is first of all, don't set your sights on something that you really can't do. Okay, you can't build Battleship Galactica. You don't have the money, you don't have the skill sets, etc. Build what you can, that you can demonstrate, preferably something that you can duplicate over and over and over and over again. Okay, so when we say modules, that's what we mean, a cubic meter modules. I'm sure you've seen these things actually. If you go to any port, freight terminal, etc. in the United States or anywhere, you'll see stack upon stack upon stack of cubic meter, milky looking plastic things that are in an iron cage, and they just stack them on top of each other. Stack. Those are called intermediate bulk cargo containers. they are waste products practically. People will give them to you, okay, because they got to get rid of them. That's what we're talking about here, Silas. Look to something that you can afford. Look to something that you can actually do. The other thing I would say is don't expect to turn a profit the first year you're in business. In fact, don't expect to turn a profit the second, third, fourth, or fifth year you're in business necessarily. And all I mean by that is make sure that you've got money to run on. You can put food on the table, you can put gas in your car, which would like for you not to do, but electricity in your electric car. Make sure you can do all of that, because it's going to take a while. It's going to take a while. People that have money don't like to shake loose of that money, but you're going to have to convince them of that. Well, convince them, not on paper. Do it. Really, you do it. Show them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's very important, because obviously usually the process to get large funding rounds is after a pilot is proven. So I want to back up, because I think it's very, very important, because that is a huge milestone to achieve, and you have to get somebody to trust you the first time. Just like when I started this podcast, the first person I asked, it was a little bit harder than the second and the third, et cetera. So how do you get to the table for these discussions to do a project with a country, right? This is a really big achievement, I think, that you're not just talking about a single kind of corporation or something. You're talking about, or even a municipality. You're working with a federal government on this. So could you talk about how you got to the table with that, and the tips you'd recommend on how they can get to the point where they can be given the opportunity to prove their minimum viable product?
Well, I would ask Beth to talk about James Scott's approach. We think it's very wise. One of the things you do, and I'll shut up and let her talk, is you want to make sure that the country's goals are synonymous with your goals. In other words, they want jobs. Okay, they want their farmers to do better. They want make sure you understand. Make sure you understand what they need, and make sure your product, process, etc., is in alignment with that. Beth, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, James does.
No, that's a very good point. James Scott is the individual who has who we've linked up with, that has these NGOs that what they're tailored to do. And we found this with our other technologies also, that this is very helpful, is there are these kind of brain trusts that come together, and what they're doing is seeking out technology to answer specific problems of whoever they're servicing. Okay, so for instance, in the case of the MC Row project, James Scott has 50 countries as his clients, including the US, and he knows what it is, the kind of technology that they're looking for, and he goes out to the market and seeks that technology and becomes the intermediary for bringing the parties together. So that's how we got with Bulgaria. Is actually Steve did a great presentation at the National Press Club, along with some of the other countries that are in this, that are being serviced by this NGO, that the Embassy Row project, and they heard about the technology that way, were interested, and then came back to us and said, we want to do a pilot project, and what we're finding is Europe seems very anxious, and they might be more anxious to resolve this, and at least in our experience, than the United States, which is a little bit disappointing. But what we're learning is that the European countries are taking a lot more definitive actions in this towards climate change and carbon removal, and they want American technology. They specifically are asking for American technology. And so if that's a good way to get this technology going, we're fine with that. We're also speaking to companies in the US, and we're launching it however we can, but we're finding that the Europeans are gravitating to it.
Mm-hmm. But in essence, to summarize this, I think it's very, very interesting to double down on this point, that essentially you followed through this individual who you're working with. I don't know how you ended up connecting with him, but going to the people or the organizations that have a lot of influence, that have an alignment of interest to basically go and put your information in front of these other organizations that do have an interest, right? They know there's a previous relationship, they know their needs, they know what you can provide, and they know there's a synergy there. and then getting those people to make those introductions. I think this is super under. People don't understand this. That is extremely important for you to get warm intros to people. It's so much better than just reaching out out of the blue, right? It's so
I
much
could have
better.
never done this by myself, just reaching out to the country of Bulgaria or
Yeah,
wherever,
exactly.
Yeah.
You need to leverage the networks of other people who have similar interests.
It's exactly right. And you raised a good point, is how did James Scott come upon us? I'll tell you that. But the axiom in business is, I know it sounds old and trite and everything, but it's not what you know, it's who you know. And boy, oh boy, is that true. Okay. And it's just a natural human thing. Okay. I know you, and you said, Steve, you should talk to so-and-so. I'm probably going to talk to him. If I don't know you from Adam, I'm not going to bother with what you have to say. I'm just not. It's too time intensive. I'm not going to do it. So that's important. But James Scott is, first of all, he is one of those people who looks broadly, looks tangentially, and develops things from uses his intuition a lot, I think. And he came upon the conclusion when he started this NGO, when he looked at carbon capture existing technology, he was like, that's never going to work. It's just plain not going to ever work. Now that's his conclusion. Okay. And that's not necessarily my conclusion, but that's what he concluded. So he said, he started casting about and looking for things that were more realistic.
Mm-hmm.
And
what he was referring to that wouldn't work are these big, monster sized industrial facilities that are being set up to capture carbon dioxide, and then using the oil companies to pipe it in, down a mile and a half or 2 miles down into the ground.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And to him, that just didn't seem realistic.
Fair enough. I do want to get through. I know we're probably going to go over on time, but I do want to get through one more question. I think would be important because I think you can answer it well. What is your experience with, in terms of the funding, getting government grants and things like that to continue the research? Like, have you had any experience with this? Any tips for other people to do this as well? Because there are a lot of people in the innovation stage, which they don't have a proven commercially viable way forward. So they need to seek these grants. Do you have any context you can offer here?
Yeah. I've been in academia for a while, and grants are the thing that drives academia. I would like Beth to talk to you about the tax angle, because she, of course, is a financial whiz. But from the standpoint of the grants, okay. First of all, people seem to think a grant is something you just sort of put a piece of paper from somebody and they give you money. That is about the furthest thing from the truth that there is. Okay. First of all, grants are a lot of work. Okay. And you don't just put an idea in front. You have to put dozens of ideas in front of a granting agency. If you get a grant, it's probably not going to be one that knocks your socks off. You may start out at, under $100,000, and in 2 years, they're going to give you maybe $1 million. And then in 5 years, you might get $2 million. And that's not the way business operates. Now, if you had 10 of those grants, that would maybe give you some, but $100,000 in a normal business is going to get spent in 3 months. Okay. I mean, it's just not enough money. That's number one. Number two, you have to have that. Universities have entire organizations that run grants. You have to have all these accountants. You have to have all of this, meetings. You have to have all these things to get these grants approved. You have a project manager from the government, and they're in your business. They are part of your business every day. They're looking at, and that's fine and good if it's an academic pursuit. If it is not an academic pursuit, and if it's something you really truly have to go fast, be efficient, change direction if you have to, et cetera, grants are not where you need to be. You need to be with people who have a vision and have money, and they're not going to give up on you just because the first year you don't quite get your milestone. They have the vision. They'll keep after it. They want to make a bunch of money. I'd rather be with somebody that wants to make a bunch of money like I do than someone who doesn't care whether I make money or not.
I mean, I think it's a really interesting, because the incentives need to be aligned, right? If you don't have the interest of the outcome to be the same, and I know it's difficult, you have to ensure that you're not just prioritizing finding the commercially viable way, just, in spite of the science, but there has to be this kind of alignment. I think it's an interesting challenge that we face right now, especially with innovation and climate tech, that I really hope somebody finds a good way to solve. So you had one other thing you want to comment on, Beth, as well on that topic?
Yeah, Beth should say that there are things besides grants that the governments can do for you, and I'll let Beth talk about that.
Yeah, well, there's a certain exemption called the 45Q exemption. Is that what you were referring to, Steve?
Yeah, exactly.
And that is an exemption that that is provided to companies that are doing, that can prove up that they're capturing carbon dioxide. But the law hasn't been, the law actually in our case is written so that it doesn't actually include our technology. Well, we say it does. We'll see. We're working right now with attorneys that are and we know that it does get beyond their defined meaning. But what it is 45Q allows for it gives you a 180, I think it'll ultimately be like $180 off of your cost. And so there's a very significant benefit for qualifying for a 45Q. It happens in our case to exempt natural solutions. Obviously at the heart of our system is photosynthesis, but there's a big machinery built around that. And so we think that law was not meant, the law was meant to say, like, if you have a yard full of trees that you can't
exactly.
Okay. And so we're working right now. Of course, they didn't foresee our technology coming. And so we're working with them now with the Treasury Department right now to explain this is not what you intended when you wrote this. And so we should fit into that exemption. And we think we'll prevail on that. But, there's just another thing that a company, even a small company has to do, hire an attorney to go plead that case and such, but it's very important to the end goal.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, I think I always find it funny, the intention behind laws versus the nuance of the laws themselves. Like, I'm a stickler for what is the purpose behind it rather than, just following the rule just to follow the rule. If it's intended to keep people safe and you keep people safe, even if you break the rule, it's okay, right?
Anyways, find that actually as lawyers, I've looked that up many times, and so you can actually get to the intentions, the stated intentions behind those laws, and that's free information that you can get when you Google search it.
Yeah,
that's right. And also the thing to remember about this is the laws are usually set up for a good reason. I mean, I have that faith. Maybe that's Pollyanna, yes, but I think they are. So 45Q, I think, was set up for a very good reason. Guess who the major beneficiary right now of 45Q tax exemption is? Oil companies.
I was going to say it probably is going to be oil companies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, enhanced
oil companies would be in charge of sequestering it deep down in the ground. And so, if we are to pump this CO2 deep down in the ground, then we're relying on oil companies to keep us safe when we all know that they probably cause this problem.
And the main reason what they want to do that is what they call EOR, and that is enhanced oil recovery.
That might be a topic for another day.
Yeah, I do think it is interesting. I mean, there's obviously a lot of kind of things that go on in the background that we definitely don't approve of, but it is interesting to see how some of these bigger organizations who have the funds can afford to hire the lawyers to argue these cases, to lobby, etc. So anyways, we're out of time here, but it's been a really great conversation. I think we've covered a lot of really fun things. And any final things to offer?
Yeah, I do. You're young. And I hope that people that watch your podcast are also young. And what I want to tell you is, from where I sit, we can kick climate change's butt. We can. We just have to have the will. We can do it. It's not impossible at all, regardless of the fact that it is a huge problem.
But we got to do it now. It's not a thing that's going to happen 10 years from now. I mean, we have to act now.
Yeah, I think it's extremely important. I really appreciate the optimism. I tend to be a very optimistic person, so it's hard to sometimes kind of see the negativity for me, but I do recognize that this is very challenging, and I think that we just need to focus on the positive and go make this happen. I know a lot of young people not myself, but there's a lot of young people who are very pessimistic about the future and what climate change will end up having. But yeah, I appreciate you coming on the show. It's really, really exciting to see what you're working on, and excited to follow your journey as you continue to grow.
Thank you so much, Simon.
All right, thanks so much for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed this, please share and review. Really, really helps us to grow the show. And of course, if you stuck around this long, please do turn on notifications to be made aware in the future. Again, the biggest help that we can have is if you can send this show to somebody else who might find it interesting. And as always, we like to send it to somebody who might not necessarily agree with the topics. We really find it interesting to share it with those types of folks and see what they think. And then we of course encourage you to reach out and connect with Beth and Steve, and reach out to them via their website, learn more about what they're doing. If this is your first time, please do, of course, subscribe and tap the bell for notifications. Quick note on our next episode. So next episode, we will be joined by Tommy Leap, the founder and CEO of Jetstream. Their website is jetstream.io. And what they are is a climate tech VC working with pre-seed companies. And this one was really fun for me, actually, because Tommy is, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the first person I followed on Twitter back in 2020 to get to know the climate tech space. When I became interested in the space, I wanted to follow people that I thought kind of were influencers in it, and Tommy was one of the people that I came across. And I had tried to have him on the show earlier, but I guess it took a little bit more credibility and time to get him on the horn. So really excited for this one. In the show we talk about his tips to founders for raising capital, especially in this current market. He has some really insightful tips there. And then secondly, we talked about his thought process for investing in companies. So it's really helpful both for VCs and for founders in the space. So stay tuned for that episode coming up. And thanks again for joining us on Clean Tech is the podcast. We will see you next time.